Good evening and greetings of peace. My name is Yusuf Ismail and I'm the host of the show I Beg to Differ. This is a program which focuses on interactive debate on socio-economic, political, cultural and religious issues affecting us as South Africans, and indeed looking at some of the dominant trends in the global and international community. Over the past 24 years, the South African situation has been indeed bleak on a number of levels. We've seen criminal politicians run riot, rampant poverty affecting all stratas of South African society, increased crime rates, and unprecedented corruption on a weekly basis and on a scale never before seen. In recent months, and more particularly since July 2018, the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, made renewed calls for land expropriation without compensation, leading to vigorous debate in society. And that's what we're going to be debating tonight. Should land expropriation be without compensation? What will the economic ramifications of such be? Should the Constitution be amended? And more particularly, is the ANC hijacking the debate for its own nefarious agenda in order to bolster its position for the 2019 elections? This is part one of the debate on this subject. We'll be joined in the future by members from AfriForum. But joining me today in the studio, Dobri Ngwenya, who is the Deputy President of AZAPO. Welcome. I'm also joined by my good friend, Advocate Andrew Dumini, member of the Christian Lawyers Association, a farmer, as well as an independent counsel. And our third panelist is Kucho Makanyele from the Wits Fees Must Fall campaign and a student activist and also a member of the SRC. Welcome to all three of you. Let me start off with you, Advocate Dumini, since we're dealing with certainly legal implications. Section 25 of the Constitution, certainly, if you could expand on that, does in fact make provisions for land to in fact, in a broad arbitrary sense, to belong to people. What's the import and implications of Section 25?
Well, Section 25 is a product of a negotiated process at CODESA. And that's a very important part of this whole debate, is where does it come from? And it seems to have been part of a trade-off of the laying down of white military and a political power to give to the majority of the people that power, but at the same time protect certain rights. But it's also an internationally recognized right that property is to be protected and is to be protected constitutionally. So it's a fundamental right. So this is where it gets very tricky, because we're talking about the possible amendment of a fundamental right.
But that's a problem that I just want to come in on that issue, and then I'm going to get to you, Dobri, is that there is the argument within legal circles that there is no need for an amendment of Section 25 because writ in large in that particular clause is a provision which encapsulates a situation that in certain circumstances land expropriation can be done without compensation. And if that provision is obviously allowed, or certainly there's an ambit leading one to the trajectory that it can in fact be allowed, then there's really no need for the amendment of the Constitution. Would I be correct on that score?
I would agree with you, and it seems that the vast majority of legal experts, including very senior retired constitutional judges, have come out and mentioned this and said we don't need to mention it because not only is property protected in Section 25, but Section 25 contains for us in South Africa the mandate for land reform. We have to do land reform, and this is where some people are missing the point. This is part of our new constitutional dispensation, and it actually tells us how we're going to do it. But it does say we must consider certain factors and we determine compensation, which could be very little compensation in certain instances, but it could be market value. That still needs to be tested by our courts.
And it hasn't yet been. And then this takes us back to the debate. 24 years since the advent of democracy, 31st of July, the announcement by Cyril Ramaphosa. Do you think it's a bit of a question of a little grandstanding or strategic maneuver by the ANC prior to the elections? We had a situation where for the past 24 years, there's been talk, there's been debate, there's been discussion somewhat on land reform, but nothing meaningful by the ANC government and nothing significant which certainly alleviates the previous status quo that was under the state of apartheid.
Yes, now I fully agree with you. Nothing significant in terms of land redistribution, in terms of sorting out the issue of land in this country has been done for the past 24 years.
Why not? I mean, the question we need to integrate, why not?
The ruling party, the ANC, had no will to do that. There was absolutely no political will to tackle the issue of land in South Africa. You must remember, in the two-way discussion with the National Party and the ANC, most of these agreements and secret talks, secret discussions that the ANC held with the ruling party at the time, there were deals that were arrived at, and we don't know what they are. But
I just want to interrupt. But prior to that, prior to CODESA, I mean, there were meetings in, for example, as early as 1985, with apparently members of the Afrikaner Boerbond, the meetings that happened in Sussex with the then later to become Thabo Mbeki, and that there were these clandestine meetings which were not in public display, as you had in CODESA, were somehow or the other. I mean, the whole discourse was that the economic the underpinning, the economic community which in fact underpinned apartheid would effectively remain the same, and that just at a very peripheral level you would see changes. I mean, the irony of the entire situation, you had someone like the present President Ramaphosa, who was very much powerful in the trade union movements in the 80s, very much opposed to Anglo-American, for example, which bankroll apartheid. Post-1994, you have a situation where he becomes co-opted and becomes the front man of Anglo-American. Do you perhaps see that this kind of political compromise is partly to blame for the present status quo that you see here?
Definitely. What Cyril is doing is just some showmanship, it's just some grandstanding. There is no seriousness or will on the part of the ANC to deal with the issue of land. And what you see here is a completely different ANC from what it stood for in the past and what they might have said. It's a different setup altogether. I think capital has co-opted many of them. I mean, you look at who they are now. Some of them are multi-billionaires. And the issue of land and black people is so crucial.
What should have been done?
What should have been done, in fact, was you shouldn't have relied so much on secret talks. Like a lot has come out of late that there was many talks, as you have indicated, Yusuf. There were many talks, and we don't know what was agreed upon. And what could have been done was from the start. You will remember that when they went for discussions, we said part of the issues on the table should be the issue of the economy. When you transform the land, you leave out the economy, you leave out the land, it is not liberation. You're simply negotiating for civil rights. What the masses of our people in South Africa obtained was civil rights, not liberation.
So basically the rights, you had this peripheral differences, blacks here, whites here. Now obviously there was some sort of purported mix. But at a fundamental economic level, there was no transformation. That's what you're saying. And there has not been transformation yet.
Not yet.
Therefore, would you say that this claim, certainly articulated in July 2018 by the President, was very much a strategic claim, bearing in mind that the opposition and certainly the EFF were bankrolling on this whole issue of land expropriation for some time, and probably as a means to garner votes for 2019, this is a strategic maneuver.
That's exactly. They are saying it and doing it for elections. And they're turning this matter into some kind of an academic exercise. Like all these issues, our people have waited for long. They want land. They want access to land. They want control of the economy. You can't continue being academic about this matter. It's dangerous. And Yusuf, let's agree. What we got as young people was an empty, fragile shell. And it is breaking up now. I mean, you look at all the politicians that you have in the ruling party, all of them have become corrupt. It looks like they have realized that, no, they took something empty. Now the emptiness is eating them now because they are unable to do anything meaningful for black people in this country, except giving black people some crumbs like your grants, your whatever. But black people have not received anything tangible in this country. I live in black communities. I can tell you about the poverty of our people. And I can tell you about how painful it is to our young men. I held a meeting with young boys in our township yesterday. They were crying tears. And we're sitting on a bombshell. You can't have a country that treats its young people like
certainly.
this.
And just hold that thought, just to bring, speaking about youth, you are, Kucho, a student activist yourself. What's this, and since I'm out of the loop of what goes on within the academic spheres, particularly among student bodies.
Yes.
What's the kind of contemporaneous discourse? Is there kind of an awareness? Because our student population, there is certainly a kind of a schizophrenic relationship that you have between certain race groups among students.
Yeah.
And so the level of discourse may not necessarily be consistent in the sense of what the position is on this particular issue. You just kind of brief us in terms of what the contemporary discussions are on the issue of land reform.
Well, students are of the opinion, I would attempt to speak on their behalf, although I'm just one person. They are of the opinion that the land question needs to be addressed quickly. And it needs to be addressed in such a way that it affords them the opportunities that were promised to the 1994 generation when they went and
Oh, you part
voted.
of the you post 94, I would assume.
Yes,
correct?
yes.
And is this but I get the sense that the kind of well, with the exception of course recently the fees must fall, but the kind of political activism or the political awareness that may have been existent within student bodies pre-1994 is no longer evident post-1994, particularly in 2018. Would I be
Yeah.
correct in that score?
No, you are right. People are more focused on advancing their own careers. They are more focused on what economic prospects do I have as a student. When I get out there,
It's somewhat more selective, more personalized,
Yes.
as opposed to a kind of a contemporary awareness and concern for the majority.
yeah, it's no longer, well, the sense that I'm getting. It's no longer what can I do to serve my community. It's about what career prospects do I have for myself and what can I get out of.
But that changed with the Fees Must Fall campaign in 2017,
In somewhat,
2016.
in somewhat.
But again, it was very personal, personally affecting students not being able to pay fees.
Yes.
But you don't have this kind of a mass furore when it comes to, for example, the socio-economic situation in the country, what's going on in the Alexandra Township, what's happening in some of the poor areas of the Eastern Cape. That kind of concern and kind of conscious awareness is not basically evident amongst the student body. Would I be correct?
No, you are correct. You must remember that students in such a way, they are isolated from their own communities. The issues that are happening from the outside, when you are within the institution itself, you are now engaging on different kind of issues. Like for instance, the fees must fall issue. That was an individualistic issue because I myself could not pay my fees and I was a recipient of a grant from NSFAS.
So very again self-centered as opposed to community-based in terms of concern for the broader aspects of people who are not necessarily involved in academia. Well, I'm just going to stop you. We just have to go for a quick ad break and we'll be back shortly. Welcome back to I Beg to Differ. I'm your host, Yusuf Ismail, and with me in the studio, I've got Dobry, Advocate Domini, and Kucho. We're basically involved in a heated discussion. I think most of us seem to be in agreement. There's not much difference in the discussion. Just before we went for a break, there's something I wanted to explore with you, Advocate Domini, is that if the Constitution, let's assume, because this is what political parties are in fact calling for, they're calling for straightforward amendment of the Constitution. Here's a dilemma that I somewhat have. If the Constitution is in fact amended to allow for land to be expropriated without compensation, my particular issue is how would the law and the legal system cater for assets on the farm and improvements made on the land? What would happen in those particular situations? I mean, because the land, if you look at some of the reports on its own, it's roughly about 10%, and you as a farmer may know, 10% of the total value of a typical farm operation. And that's obviously you take into account the fixed immovable assets into account. Now, would sunk investments, for example, such as your general farm infrastructure, other investments assets such as farm machinery, which are about 90% of the value of the farm, be obviously subjected to expropriation without compensation? Or do we deal with a situation where just simply empty land is given away without any machinery, any equipment, which could basically mean the death of the farm itself? How do you basically cross that particular position? Because, and I just want to drive this point further. We've had a situation where people have acquired farms. 10 years later, Similar to the Zimbabwean situation, those farms are basically effectively non-existent, non-operational, empty land. What do we do in a situation like that? And how do we overcome this?
Well, let's come back. I think your first question is how are we going to cater for it? How are we going to cater for the infrastructure on farms? Quite honestly, I don't think anybody knows. I don't think we have any answers at the moment. We've never done this before. We've never really grappled with it. And I think this is an opportunity for us to actually engage with it. The Constitutional Court has actually said we're waiting for this type of situation.
But they want
to look
immediate
at it.
results. I mean, the indication I get from government, they want something immediate, instantaneous. But there's so many bulwarks and complications along the way. How do we confront this?
Well, I think we need to be realistic and look. And I'd like to differ with the take on land reform at the moment. At the moment, 2018, we're looking back at 24 years and we're saying nothing's happened. I beg to differ. There is, without a doubt, a huge movement in South African legal system, number one, to protect security of tenure. That was the first pillar of land reform. We've made huge strides with that. The PI Act, Esther, numerous pieces of legislation that we work with in the courts all the time that we see are protecting people. Don't underestimate that. Give credit to government where it's due. I believe in giving credit. I'm not a politician, so I can give credit. I acknowledge they've done great work with that. Restitution process. There have been millions of hectares.
There's a distinction between the two, restitution and settlement reform.
They say the three pillars of land reform are security of tenure, restitution of land in terms of the Restitution Act, and redistribution. Now, we've been doing restitution and we are busy with redistribution, and now we need to focus on redistribution. That's where we need to go. The Constitution as it currently stands talks about factors to be taken into consideration when you consider expropriation. They are, for example, the use of the land, the history, the investment of state asset, of state infrastructure, the history of the land acquisition, the use of the land by a farmer or a previous farmer. These all have to be taken into account, but we don't actually know yet how we're going to do this. And this is where we need strong leadership from Parliament, and most probably more from the Constitutional Court that will guide us in this process.
There's the additional aspect, far more complicated, is that agricultural land in South Africa is heavily indebted.
Absolutely.
And the point is that farm debt is linked to the actual land through title deeds that may have been probably secured through loans of some sort. That process is not, I mean, to kind of overcome that particular case, these two scenarios, expropriation without compensation, we're considering it becoming a reality. These are fundamental problems to overcome. It's not just simply easy, because then you've got the pernicious banks, and you've got a whole host of factors surrounding. I mean, is that not a problem? Just what Edgar Domini stated, that there are these bulwarks to the idea. Certainly, land expropriation without compensation. People want land. That's fundamentally important. But the fact is that you've got these problems inherent in the existing strata that cannot just simply be easily overcome if you just simply go and take away the land and leave it at that.
Yes, you don't put challenges and say these are insurmountable. A project like this project of land repossession is a huge project, and it will have to be supported by all. I'm calling on all our people, white people in particular. Like Advocate Domini, I urge him to go out and speak to white people and say, land repossession is a must. It is a program that has to happen in South Africa. Just like our transition to democracy was not easy, was complicated, but look where we are. We've had one thing we've had is a democracy that has been a bit functional, although with some challenges here and there. But we cannot therefore, because there are huge challenges, it involves banks and whoever, and say therefore it has to be slowed down or whatever. I also want to deal with the issue of 24 years. Advocate speaks about Esther. Now, most of the laws that were passed in the period were more oppressive, like your extension of Security of Tenures Act. I know of people who were offered small pieces of land. In fact, the farmer would say, to keep them quiet, let me offer them 20 hectares of my 12,000 farm, size of my farm, 12,000 hectares farm. And they were given security of tenure on 10 hectares. This is the typical story throughout South Africa. So there's been a lot of that chicanery in terms of land redistribution, because to be honest is the white community has never been willing to part with land. And the pieces of land, probably the 3% which the state has purchased, those are not viable lands in most cases. I've been to those lands throughout the country, many parts of the country. There are farms that are no longer viable for effective agricultural.
I want you to address this narrative and then just obviously amplify AZAPO's official position. This narrative that is dominant, I don't know if it's called simplistic or not, but goes to the core of the whole debate. The argument is, after 350 years, the native majority, crudely put, native majority is landless, and about approximately 40,000 farmers or white families own 80% of the land. Now, this kind of narrative has been challenged by groups like AfriForum, who hasn't joined us today, other right-wing extreme organizations like Sakelanders. But is there some degree of justification for the idea that a small proportion of farmers, white farmers, own the majority of the land?
It is not justifiable. I mean, how do we speak to white people and say, this is wrong, and we must all change the status quo? We must deal with this matter as a matter of agency. I mean, we can no longer talk about saying compensation or willing buyer, willing seller. It has not worked.
But the other argument, sorry to interrupt, but the other argument is that, and this again is things which are thrown off at the recent Parliamentary Committee on Land Reform when AfriForum was there, and I think this needs to be probably checked. Their argument that they put out that was that black people in this country already own more than half of the agricultural land in two provinces, Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. And according to the Audit of Land Ownership released in 2018, their statistics were that landowners who are not white own 26.7% of agricultural ground and control more than 46% of South Africa's agricultural potential in these particular, well, in the scheme of the South African country, but in two major provinces, Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. Is this really true?
No, but they know that is not true. I hope AfriForum was here. They know that is not true.
Well, we may join them at a forthcoming engagement.
In Eastern Cape or in KZN, large tracts of agricultural land in KwaZulu-Natal are owned by white people. I mean, you're talking of Ingonyama Trust land in KZN, tiny pieces of land, former townships and some areas close to them, and traditional lands. I think what is messing up a debate here is the masses are being threatened. They are saying, if as black people we take control, particularly of agricultural land, there is going to be starvation in this country. That is stupid narrative. I mean, we have seen black farmers who are so willing and go out of their way, spend the last penny to see to it that those farms that they've acquired are working. And they have no access to funding. Any black person who attempts to get involved in funding, there is so much conspiracy against him. He doesn't get funding from the land bank. How do you account for the fact that the land bank, being a government institution, has utilized 80% of its funds funding previously the privileged white communities, farmers in South Africa? 80% of their funding. And the commercial banks, I've been to the commercial bank asking them for funding for viable agricultural projects. They won't come to the party. That's been a problem for black farmers in South Africa. Any narrative that says black people are going to create starvation, it's an insult and it's racist.
I mean, I tend to agree with Mr. Ngwenyo on that point, is that generally speaking, it seems to me that where indeed you do have a transfer of land, black farmers are set up for failure, either directly or indirectly. Obviously, at some level, government has a lot to account for in terms of how the land subsequently evolves under the ownership of black farmers. Even though the argument is, and this again is question of statistics, but the argument is apparently 17,439 million hectares have been transferred from white ownership since 1994. That's equivalent to about 21%. Of the total land freehold in South Africa. But in a general sense, when the land is transferred, they're set up for failure. There's no experience, no support structure, no hands-on assistance, nothing.
Farming has changed dramatically over the years. I don't think one can ever approach farming, for example, as a hobby. I've tried for 15 years. My neighbors consider me still to be a hobby farmer, although I'm trying to become a commercial farmer.
You're an agricultural farmer, am I correct?
I do beef. I do
beef.
beef, and that's what I'm getting into. I think the problem is farming has become highly specialized, very technical. It is a science today. And if you're going to compete in global markets today, you need those expertise. The question is, have their expertise been given? And are they there in the black community? And is there support for them in the black community to be able to farm?
Is there support? I mean, from what you can see.
Well, from what I can see, there are extension offices all over. Government has the infrastructure in place, but not necessarily the help for it. But there are other problems that have come up. For example, some of the beneficiaries on land, and I think Mr. Ngwenya will agree with me, are not people who are the people who should be getting the land. They might be, as has been quoted now, the people with the Gucci shoes or the fat cats in the city, for example, and they're not the people who know how to work the land. So they will be getting an income, they'll be leasing the farm out, and they'll be getting an income. But I'd also beg to differ here. Some of our best agricultural land has been purchased by the state in the past.
What's happened to that? That's a deep. A lot of land has in fact been purchased. Indeed. What's happened to that land?
Some of the land is being farmed. Some of the land, there is support in certain farming communities where commercial farmers are bringing in infrastructure. They are showing guys how to do it. For example, in our area, we have the emerging farmer of the year a couple of years ago, Grain SA, Mr. Morris Bocki, who planted thousands of hectares of maize, who did incredibly well, and is a highly respected member of the Farmers Union where I am, one of the most amazing gentlemen around, and he is making a difference. So it depends on the community that you're in, it depends on the support from the local farmers as well. That's where we've got to go.
By and large is not there. I mean, an ideal situation probably would be a sort of a partnership, an ideal situation.
I think it is there. I'm listening to Agri SA. I see what our Farmers Union in Cedarville and Districts Association is doing to engage with emerging farmers, mentorship, capacity, helping. The farm next door to me is a very good farm that was bought by a black gentleman who's passed away now through the land bank 10 years ago. So I beg to differ. There is access to the land bank. I think the land bank is doing great work in trying to facilitate purchases of farms. So I'm seeing it around me.
Yusuf, I said, these are correct statistics. 80% of land bank's funding was used to fund white farmers. That's it. Check your statistics. Well, it's correct. That's the
I'm just going to continue the debate. We have to go for a quick ad break, and we'll be back shortly. Welcome back to I Beg to Differ, and I'm your host, Yusuf Ismail. Well, just before we went to the ad break, Dobry, there was something that you pointed out where I think there's some sort of divergence between you and Advocate Domini. The whole notion of the fact that the land bank, according to you, has been selective in terms of funding, that government has been selective in terms of funding. What was your contention on that? What was your dispute on that issue?
No, my dispute is you can't have a bank that is funded by the state. The basis of our constitution is restitution, helping the previously disadvantaged.
But if it's privately owned, can't you see the dilemma? If the bank was privately controlled, the basis for selectivity might have been more accentuated in terms of...
No, but the land bank is the state bank. It's funded entirely by the state. So the state should come in and say to the bank and give criteria and say, you're going to utilize so much of your funding on the previously disadvantaged. But it hasn't done that. I'm honest on this one, and it's a very painful story. And even parliamentarians, when that report was presented, they felt really bad about it. It's true. How could you have that? So we must urge government, look into this matter and see how emerging black farmers...
Yeah, but what's the rationale behind that? What's the rationale for non-funding then?
I don't know. But you see, maybe some of these institutions are still controlled by predominantly white people who might not come down to the level of understanding that here's a group of young people they want to farm. They don't have any collateral, they don't have this and that. As a result of inequality in our country, our people would not have the collateral, our people would not have the funding, our people would not have implements and whatever. So any banking institution has got to understand those realities of the situation of black people. And it is shocking that your land bank doesn't understand them. ABSA doesn't, FNB. Only your commercial banks will not understand the plight of a black farmer. and then comes the statement, black people are failing. And secondly, the state itself, government. Government is not coming to the party. You know, I've got to be honest here, with a kind of leadership, some of the farms that were acquired by the state were given to comrades. Comrades who had no experience on farming, that is true.
Extremely common.
And those are the comrades who received all the help from the state. And you're not helping. You see, with our land repossession program, we want land to benefit the poorest of the poor. I mean, your labor tenants on farms in our area, Paul Petersburg, Freiheit, Utrecht, are not benefiting from land redistribution or restitution or whatever. We want land to benefit the poorest of the poor. People in the countryside are the people that must benefit. Now, with the kind of a corrupt ruling party, the land redistribution or land repossession program might go astray.
So the whole nationalized, because that's basically it. And again, you mentioned restitution. Restitution, basically, the community was legally living on a piece of land, and then of course it was taken from them, and they need to get the land back, providing sufficient proof. Redistribution is if you're, for example, owning the land and you're not supposed to take the land. But the sad thing is, a lot of the land is being nationalized by government, and you're saying that land is now being given to cadres and comrades and to a selective few, which kind of rings again of corruption. Can't say sense of, I wouldn't say nepotism. There's no, well, there may be familial bond between certain individuals, politicians, and perhaps family members in those instances. But just bringing you back, and I want to bring you back on this point. You alluded to Agri-SA. Ernest Pringle, who is the chairperson of Agri-SA's Policy Committee on Agricultural Development, he said a long time ago that a comprehensive land audit was in fact imperative because the policy was being driven by perception of emotion instead of actual facts. They invested something like 1 million rands in this whole audit. And this is what he says. He says a picture of land ownership, and more specifically land ownership of high potential agricultural land, actually looks totally different to what the perception is. Now, is there any kind of, and I'm going to ask you to address it, and probably Kucho, is there any kind of substance to that idea and that notion, or is the reality still bleak?
I agree entirely with what Pringle has said. I have done, for example, in our own area, tried to do my own audit, and there have been calls for a comprehensive audit for many, many years. The issue is that the audit doesn't address the inequality. I don't agree, for example, that we are on an 87-13% land split, 13% owned by black, 87% by white. Some people are still throwing that figure around. It's changed dramatically.
What's the actual figures? Because I'm going to ask Zapa to come. What's the actual figures?
It's really, really difficult to say.
Leitama, and like Leitama, your, I wouldn't say protege, or your individual under your leadership or wing, points the idea again, and this is the point that he made in a letter that he in fact wrote to Virgin founder Richard Branson after Branson's acquisition was, in this country was described as stolen. This is what he said. He says, a dominant idiom since 1652 is that of the settler who imposed it upon the native majority through force of arms. The result of his conquest is 350 years later, the native majority is landless. About 40,000 white families own 80% of the land. That is the narrative. And that's why the land debate is happening, and that's why there's talk about land expropriation or reform. Are you saying those figures are not accurate?
I don't think those figures are accurate. What we do see, however, is changes in agriculture. It wasn't 40,000 families owning it previously. Agriculture has got bigger and bigger. There are bigger farms. There are fewer, smaller farmers around. So it used to be 120,000 farmers, white commercial farmers. We're down now probably to about 30,000 white commercial farmers. Now, what do they own? Now, the stats that we're talking about, do they include the entire country? Do they include arable land? Do they include grazing? For example, if someone says, well, 80% or 60% of the land is owned by white farmers, what does that include? Does it include vast parts of the Karoo that are semi-desert, that aren't arable? Or do we go back to the stats, for example, that AfriForum are pulling out, but they seem to be piggybacking on some of the stats on the research from Agri-SA that show that 70-something% of agricultural land in KZN is not white owned, and majority of land in the Eastern Cape is not white owned. We actually need to grapple with some of these statistics. They can be very difficult. It's not white owned. And in our area where I farm at the moment, we are a small minority of landowners. For example, 1976, the formation of Transkei, many white owners were expropriated to form the Transkei. So our area where I farm, for example, has a smaller group of white farmers than many other areas. And we are a very small minority on land. Proportionally, there's no need, if you're looking at stats and targets, for land reform. So land reform is going to focus on other areas to get the balance right. But we still live in a country with tremendous inequality. That's what we need to address. So whether we're talking about white farmers, black farmers, whatever it is, there's inequality and there's poverty. And unless we address the inequality and poverty, we have a problem.
Is it true again? I mean, the majority of land in South Africa is inarable, am I correct? The vast majority, large swathes of land are extremely inarable. In fact, there's talk that prior to the whole notion of the advent of farming and with the kind of modern day industrial revolution, sophisticated technology, the land in South Africa could not be farmed. This is a kind of I don't know if it's revisionist material, but the kind of discourse that is being churned out by groups like Satelanders and AfriForum and so on. Is that true? Is there some degree of truth to that, or is it kind of a justification after the fact, an apologetic motif that is being presented by them to justify their particular position?
Well, I think there's a lot of moving of statistics and justification and jumping on the bandwagon here and there. We have vast sections of our land that are not arable. We're a water scarce country, extremely scarce in many areas. It's difficult to farm in certain areas, but we have been able to do it. And we have some beautiful agricultural productive areas in our country, and those must be utilized for our people and for the benefit of the country.
That's the whole point. And then again, in the debate, for example, there was a television debate with Cornelius Janse van Rensburg from it's an Afrikaans business rights watchdog called AfriSec or AfriSec. This was a television debate, I believe, on E! News or SABC. The EFF spokesman in Gauteng, Mandiso Mashego, was adamant that 80% of this land in South Africa is deemed agricultural. I would challenge that, whether it's agricultural or not. And that 80% of that is owned by, again, white farmers. Janse van Rensburg, who is the Business Rights Watch Group, stated it's total nonsense. It's not so. Do you still challenge the notion, which Advocate Domini has put forth, that the land in KZN, at the very least, is not predominantly owned by white farmers?
I challenge that, particularly if you are dealing with statistics that come from AfriForum and those that are defending the status quo.
Agri-SA as well?
Agri-SA is defending the status quo. Agri-SA has come out clearly in defending the status quo, not wanting to have anything to do with land repossession. I mean, they've been defending this thing for a long time. And we therefore cannot, as an organization, any organization could come with its own figures until we have accurate figures. But the latest figures that were released by the state show the difference, that large portions of land, both in Eastern Cape and in KZN, large tracts of land, farmland, are owned by white people. And then you've got to come back to arable land, suitable land. I think 95% of arable land, 95% of land that could be productive is in the hands of white people. I still reiterate the fact that a lot of land that was released on the basis of willing buyer, willing seller, were those pieces of lands that were not arable. There's a lot of such land. And there are a lot of such lands that have been given to black people.
But they're inarable. Are you saying the inarable land has been given?
Inarable land.
And arable land has obviously been selectively given to, as you mentioned earlier, cadres and comrades.
Yes. Let's talk about that. There has been such a program in South Africa.
Do you know any practical examples? I mean, we see this regular reports, but I mean, throw the names out. Any practical examples, high-level figures in the ANC, certainly. Presidents, the former ex-presidents, family members, a lot of leading people in the political party and their families.
I mean, you look around and tell me which one of those that are senior leaders are without some good land around. The chairperson of the other house of parliament owns land, big land in which animals are abused. I mean, I'm talking about big guys.
There was a report, animals were subjected to abuse.
We've had that report. Ministers have large tracts of land in this country. And that's another angle. When land is repossessed, it has to benefit the poorest of the poor. Unless we'll take the Zimbabwe route. I mean, if you look at land repossession in Zimbabwe, ministers and ZANU-PF cronies received large tracts of land.
Well, there's
Mugabe, the
the
old man
Zimbabwe,
himself.
and that's the point. The Zimbabwean experience, especially when you've got a corrupt government in place, tells us that expropriation without compensation, in that context, is a catastrophically bad idea. And I just want to bring you in because your president, the SRC president, I forget his name, last year on television, lauded Robert Mugabe as someone that he deeply respects, someone that he admires, and someone whose policies that he believes need to be obviously implicated. I'm not so sure if you saw that interview that he had, I think with Leanne Manas, but it was on SABC News, just at the height of the Fees Must Fall campaign, where the name of Mugabe was bandied around. Now, having idealistic notions is one thing, but having support for political ideas which are in fact indeed wholly bankrupt is another entirely.
I'm not aware of the interview, but I do know that he's a sober-minded guy. He was probably alluding to some of the projects that President Mugabe has done, which are beneficial to his people. I'm sure there's a lot that Mugabe has done, which is good. Not all has been bad, I'm sure.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna have to. We're gonna come and explore this, but we have to go for a quick ad break, as my producer tells me, and we'll be back shortly. Welcome back to our Beg to Differ, and this is our final segment. We've been having a very robust debate on the issue of land expropriation without compensation. Just before we went for the break, and I just wanted to, I raised with you the kind of Zimbabwean experience, and the point is that the Zimbabweans might have seized the land without compensation 80 years ago, but they actually collectively paid for it through 8 consecutive years of economic decline and so on and so forth. I just want to, you've heard the debate that's been going on between these two fine gentlemen. What's your take and your experience?
My understanding is that the government is unwilling or incapable of doing the right things.
Our government
Is incapable of doing what they promised us to do, right? From my own experience, my grandfather and I, we have a small holding farm where we do maize, right? We wanted to expand, but we had a problem because the land is based on communal land. So you have to go to the traditional chiefs to get permission to do that. And that has not happened. But in realizing that I cannot wait for the government to say, here's the land, I've approached the Department of Agriculture back home.
What was the response?
The response is that, no, come in, we'll educate you, but that's the only response that you get. We'll educate you, wait for learnerships to come through. That has not happened. So in realizing that I cannot wait for the government to say, here's a piece of land, go and farm, I've actively sought out people that I know are doing farming, that I can learn from.
Well, you learned from Advocate Domini now, Domini.
Yesterday, I was actually involved in one of the operations on the farm. Unlike people who say that I would like to be in farming, but yet do not even know the operations that happen on the farming. They don't know how to clear a huge tract of land to create proper fencing. Those are the things that I was involved in yesterday. So I've went and sought out someone who can act as a mentor to give me the practical skills that you need in order to operate the farm, and then from there, it can be successful.
Again, to take me back, it's a kind of practical assistance that is required. Giving people farms without any know-how is also a recipe for disaster.
It is, definitely.
But we're just coming back to the...
I asked some senior ANC leaders, what's your policy on agriculture? They haven't come up with any clear policy on agriculture. And of course, on a lot of issues, they haven't had any clear policy. What is their policy? When you rule a country, we rely on your policy. You tell the country that this is what you are going to do. In their election manifesto, it's a small issue. So we haven't had any clear policy on the part of the ANC. And recently, I think the National Department of Agriculture is going around provinces trying to come up with a policy which will only be ready next year. I mean,
What's the success rate? Do you think they will succeed with this policy? I mean, with the fracas and debacles that are happening in other departments?
I don't think so. That is why, as politicians, we are going out. We are up and about, telling our people that next year is an important year in this country, and they must not vote the ANC. I mean, coupled with the issue of land, how do you entrust the issue of land repossession to the ANC? When they have failed structures, organizations that were functional. Where is your ESCOM now? What's happening to
Total
ESCOM?
disaster.
Where is your SAA? Where is your Transnet? Where is your Telcom?
What about SASA? SASA, social grants?
The latest is the bank haste. Something the world has never seen. Monies of people were looted by the same organization. So we are going about telling our people to say,
don't vote for the ANC.
Come 2019, the ANC has messed up big time. Don't vote the ANC. On the issue of land, we have spoken about this issue. We have dealt with this issue of land from our conception. In
I never interrogated on you. Do you believe in land expropriation without compensation? That's what
I believe so, yes.
in every single situation or contextually?
In every single situation. You just remove the clause on land expropriation with compensation. That's your first step. Remove that in your
So you're calling for nationalization?
So nationalization.
You nationalize, yes.
So nationalization.
It is a constitutional.
And does this just clarify, because there's also some debate. Does this include all land? Does this include farmland? Does this include private houses, residential areas?
First you nationalize all land, and then come up with legislation to deal with.
What happens to the what happens to the issue of bonds and houses that are bonded and bond?
Farms are heavily bonded. Farmers are heavily indebted.
What happens to that? What happens to that?
That's the issue. Then you negotiate. Banks must come to the party.
And private land, residential property.
You've got to have a separate legislation. It's a process. You deal differently with the sector of land. Have legislation dealing with the different sector.
I mean, Itama presented the argument, and I think you may have seen this, that you cannot have a situation where someone in Alexandra Township is living in a single hovel, and you've got two individuals living in a 7-bedroom house in Sandton municipality. But I mean, the reality is the kind of, can the inequalities be suddenly overcome by taking drastic measures? I mean, it brings me to, for example, the whole notion of Stalinist Russia, or what happened in Cambodia during the rise of Khmer Rouge, or in parts of Latin America. When a sudden move or an about turn, where there's a social upheaval, society's turned upside down, it's a recipe for total anarchy, disorder, and disaster. How do you overcome that?
It is not always like that. I mean, you're sitting with anarchy right now. I mean, look at your Durban here. What do black people own in the CBD? What land do black people own in the industrial area? Black people virtually own nothing. So you don't keep it on agricultural land. You talk about land in South Africa in general. I mean, where I come from, blacks have been confined to previously where they were located. You see, black people were located. We call the places where we live locations.
So are you calling for a socialist state? Are you calling for a socialist state?
We are a socialist.
We are a capitalist state at this point in time.
Yes.
Even though the ANC. I mean, this argument, and I'll bring
a capitalist state that has bred so much inequality, a capitalist state that has inflicted so much pain on black people.
Which is schizophrenic in a sense, because one of their allies are the SACP, the Communist Party. I think South Africa is unique in the sense that you've got the only country in the world where the communists and the capitalists are in bed together. but that's another issue. The picture presented by Azapo, is that sustainable? Can we sustain that? I mean, looking, for example, at the Zimbabwean experience, Zimbabwean government wanted to get rid of the headaches that emerged. In that thoughtless moment, they wiped up about $10 billion in land value. People are dissatisfied. There's been inequality that's been caused. What do we do?
I think the model that's proposed by ZAPA and various other political parties is not sustainable. And I would say that even if you take every single white person out of South Africa or Africa, remove all the white people, all the white farmers, the model is still not sustainable. So sometimes I think we need to also look at what does the race and the race perception and possibly the polarization of society have to do with this at the moment? And this is something I'm really worried about at the moment, because I see the extreme left moving in a direction, pulling people away, the extreme right pulling people away, and we're being polarized. We can't have these conversations. And then again, I would beg to differ with you on Agri-SA. Agri-SA has got involved with land reform and are committed to land reform. I've been astounded to see how they've been moving this under the leadership of Dan Crick. And it was inconceivable if I look at the leadership of the past, quite honestly. I think we have incredible goodwill. And we as civil society need to start fighting against the polarization of society and pull people together to find solutions. Because I see that we can find solutions. For example, if I can see Kujo here wants to farm, how do we facilitate this for him? He has a legal degree. He's getting into law as well, but he's also getting into farming. He wants to understand it. How can we help him? There is so much goodwill out there from 94 that we've missed it. Something's happened in the last 10 years that we're missing each other. And we've got to get back to talking to one another again in this country.
Well, one thing that has also come out, and maybe both of you can address, and Kucho as well, is that in South Africa now, presently, there's a move towards urbanization. That people don't actually want to be in the rural areas.
It's huge.
And when you're talking about sustainable land to stay on, work opportunities are in the major cities of South Africa, which are not farmland. Now, that's been used to galvanize the position, wrongly so I would say, that the status quo must remain. But what do you say about that? Is that the case that, and this is a report that was before the Parliamentary Review Committee on Land Reform, and I'm not so sure how and where the facts and figures came from, but the argument was being presented that when people are offered land and offered money or job opportunities, they would go for the job opportunities. I want you to deal with it, and I'm going to get back to you, and of course you, Kucho.
And sometimes it's about the money. Land restitution claims, many claimants have opted for the money. And that's one of the biggest concerns we have. There's a lot of corruption involved in some of the situations that I've been asked to advise on. And I'm really worried about it. You can't just take the money and then you're still in poverty at the end of the day, because it's all gone. So that is definitely an aspect we've got to look at. But we've also got to look at the sustainability of this for the country with urbanization. A very valid point. We're looking at possibly 70% urbanization within the next 20 to 30 years. That's huge. Farms are going to get bigger, more competitive, more industrial, more technical, more scientific. And those farms have to support the cities.
Okay, I want to bring you in on this, and then we can just wrap up. 40 seconds, 45 seconds.
Yeah, we cannot go backward on the issue of land
Absolutely,
reformation. And all of us, all of South African of Indian origin, maize extraction, white people, we need to support this program of land repossession. It is the only way in which we could deal with inequality in this country. It is the only way in which this country can achieve true liberation, in which all its citizens will enjoy being.
If there's one message that a ZAPO deputy president wants to send to the leadership of this country, what would it be?
The message I would send is, if they could assist us from now until next year, stop corruption in this country. There's so much corruption. It's saddening. We have sad stories day after day. And they must not use the issue of land for electoral purposes. It is the issue that has to be resolved honestly. They must be honest on the issue and never speak in forked tongues. We need to settle.
Kucho, last few seconds.
In speaking to a group of farmers in Richmond, I said to them, the solutions will come from the communities, not the fed kids at the top, not the union building. It will come from the average person in the community. So I urge all the farmers in the community to come together and find solutions that best fit their needs. That would be my...
Edward Dumini, last few seconds.
I think we've got to find each other. We've got to keep talking. We must fight polarization. We must keep the extremes out of this debate as much as possible, and as civil society we must get together. There have been more purchases of agricultural land than by black communities and black business people than by government. The people can do this. The people are already showing us the way, that this is the way we're going to go. As people, we've got to come together and we've got to be finding one another in this discussion. Land reform is a very important part of our country for the future.
Well, I want to thank all three of you. We hope to have more engaging debate in the near future. It's been great to have you. And that's all we have for this evening, folks. You've been watching I Beg to Differ. We've been having a robust debate on the issue of land reform without expropriation. This is a program which focuses on interactive debate on socio-economic, political and cultural issues. My name is Yusuf Ismail. I'm your host. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you, and good evening.